Okay, we are exactly at 9:30, so I think we will begin in the interest of time. Hello, everybody. Greetings to all of you. I am Yasmeen Hassan. I'm the Global Executive Director of Equality Now, and I'm really happy to be the moderator of this launch of the Global Family Laws Campaign. I want to just take a moment to acknowledge the difficult time that we are all in with this pandemic, and I hope that all of you and your families are safe and healthy and that you will remain so. Thank you all for taking the time to be with us today as we have a global conversation on important next steps to advance gender equality. Now, 2020 marks the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Platform for Action. And this is 25 years ago, 189 countries pledged to remove all sex discrimination in the law. 4 years after Beijing in 1999, Equality Now launched its first campaign against sex discriminatory laws. And while we have seen that there has been progress since Beijing, family laws that are governed by religion or custom have not changed that much. So this is an area where we see there's been a lag. The family is the basic unit of society, and we are seeing this even more right now in the midst of the pandemic where people are isolating at home with their families. That is the unit. And we have seen that discrimination in the family impacts the ability of women and girls from moving forward in many, many ways. So we had planned to launch this Global Family Laws campaign at the 25th anniversary of Beijing at the United Nations for three main reasons. First of all, we have always known that, as I've mentioned before, that this family law is a critical area of reform for women and girls, but there has been no agreement within women's rights groups on how and if to proceed within religious frameworks. We have now bridged this gap, and in this campaign, you will hear from partners working within religious, customary, and secular law frameworks side by side for women's equality. The second reason is that if we do not address this bastion of discrimination, other efforts at equality will fail. Most of the countries, if you look at the countries who are at the bottom of the gender equality surveys, most, if not all of them, have discriminatory family laws. So we think it's essential to address this issue, and now is the time. And lastly, globally, equality in law has been acknowledged as a priority issue by international standard setters, such as the United Nations and the World Bank. So there is great momentum internationally to move this forward, and so the timing is right. So I'll give you a brief what you can expect in this webinar. We will hear from experts on family laws, followed by presentations from partners in the Global Family Laws campaign. And at the end of the webinar, there will be time for question and answers. Please write your questions. If you look on the side of your screen, there is a chat box. You can write your questions in that chat box. Antonia Kirkland, my colleague, will be collecting those questions and grouping them together for the end of the conversation. Unfortunately, those of you who are joining by phone will not have the opportunity to ask questions because we will be taking them in the chat box. So with that, we will start the launch, and I welcome now Professor Mala Htun to set the stage for this discussion. Professor Htun is a professor of political science at the University of New Mexico, and she has done extensive research on the issues of family laws around the world. Dr. Htun will take you through a brief overview of her global study on family laws. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and to collaborate with all of you on this critically important campaign. Can we switch to the next slide, please? So my role is to just give everybody here a global overview of the situation in family law. The first thing to notice is that since the 1960s, there has been a rights solution for women in multiple areas. Countries have changed laws and adopted policies in the areas of violence against women, parental leave, reproductive rights, women's leadership, tons of countries with gender quotas. But family law in large parts of the world has remained uniquely stubborn. And this is a big area for concern because family law is also uniquely important. So after giving you an overview, I'm going to present some data showing you that family law is strongly associated with major indicators of women's economic empowerment. And in fact, family law is a better predictor of how women are empowered economically than other indicators such as laws governing women's rights in the labor market and the extent to which countries have work-life balance policies. Next slide, please. What do I mean by family law? So in our study, we use data from the World Bank's Women, Business, and the Law data set. These are data from over 140 countries. And the family law indicator we constructed consists of a total of about 13 indicators. And it includes issues like the following. Does the law explicitly state that married women are required to obey their husbands? Do women, married women, have equal property rights? Do all women, daughters, sisters, wives, have equal rights to inherit property with men? Do women have the right to work without male guardian's permission? Do they have the right to travel? May they leave the house? Could they apply for a passport? Can they enroll their children in school? Can they register a business? Does their testimony in court share the same evidentiary power as a man's, etc.? So this is the cluster of issues that we call family law that we are measuring in our study. Next slide, please. So this map gives you an overview of the values of these 140-some countries around the world on our family law index. The lighter colored countries are more egalitarian. That is, they have a lower score. So what we've done is basically summed up all of the laws on these issues. The highest score, that means the most discriminatory country, gets about an 11. Okay, so of all the 13 possibilities, the highest actual score is about an 11. And those are the darker colors. So in this map, red basically means bad, lots of discriminatory family law. And we can see that there's a strong regional clustering with countries in the MENA region, some parts of Central Africa, as well as Southeast Asia. These countries tend to have a cluster of family law provisions that discriminate against women, whereas the rest of the world over time has tended to reform these provisions. And we can come back to this slide later, but in the interest of time, I'm going to keep moving. Next slide, please. So this slide gives you a summary of the map. There are 97 countries, that is, about 2/3 of the countries actually now have no restrictions. A further 25 countries have only one restriction, and the rest have plenty. So mostly progressive in the family law area are Australia, Norway, Portugal, and Slovakia, as well as other women's rights areas. Mostly lagging: Malaysia, Democratic Republic of Congo, Oman, Afghanistan, Kuwait, Palestine, Iraq, Yemen, United Arab Emirates, Syria, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Sudan. These countries are mostly laggards across a variety of indicators. Now, if we look at family law and other laws related to women's work and women's equality, we see that countries can be progressive in some areas and regressive on others. Next slide, please. This is a problem because family law is uniquely important for women's economic empowerment. Now, this slide, most of you probably cannot see, but it is the multivariate regression that is underscoring the point that I'm going to summarize for you, is that if we look across 5 indicators of women's economic empowerment, how many women have a bank account, how many women participate as owners in firms in the economy, women's labor force participation, how many women are participating in the informal sector, on the idea that we want more women in the formal sector where they have formal labor rights and fewer in the informal sector, and the wage gap. This figure basically sums up our multivariate regression of the relationship between that family law index you saw in the map and these 5 indicators of women's economic empowerment. And what this figure says is that on the first three, women having bank accounts, women owners of firms, and women participating in the labor force, that family law is the most powerful factor associated with these indicators of women's economic empowerment. It's more powerful than laws discriminating against women in wage work and how many days of paid parental leave the country has. Next slide, please. So just summing up, we need to care about family law because it really matters for how women are empowered economically. And in fact, it's more important than something some of us might find more obvious. Whether women can do night work, whether women have equal wages with men, whether pregnant women can work, and these labor law indicators. It's uniquely important. It's uniquely stubborn in a huge part of the world. So family law is important, and it's not moving, and this campaign could be a very much needed push to get family law moving. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Htun. Really appreciate your putting the big picture forward here. I grew up in Pakistan, and I knew how family law impacted, women members of my own family at a personal level, when you're not allowed to marry who you want, divorce when you want to, or have custody of your children, in addition to all these other indicators that you have shown here. So we know in the women's rights movement that family law is at the heart of discrimination against women. And I want to now turn to Zainah Anwar, who is the Executive Director of Musawah, which is a global movement for equality and justice in the Muslim family. Now, Musawah provides Muslim advocates all over the world resources to counter mainstream, read patriarchal, interpretations of Islamic law. Now, Zainah, as a fellow Muslim, I can ask you this question. Why do we find so many Muslim countries, including high and medium income countries, at the bottom of various gender equality surveys, including World Economic Forum Gender Gap Survey, the World Bank Women Law and Business Survey, and others? Over to you, Zainah. We can't hear you. Zainah, we need to unmute.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, yeah, well, the key reason is really because these countries, these Muslim countries, most of them continue to have family laws that discriminate against women in so many ways. And the sad fact is that until today, these laws are based on a classical legal framework for a different time and a different circumstance and a different period of history. But this classical legal framework that regards men as superior to women and have authority over women and are therefore entitled to rights and privileges that women do not have continue until today to underpin the Muslim family laws of these countries. So this discriminatory legal framework, as the research shows, of course, then gets translated into our daily lives, putting women at a disadvantage in the family and therefore in the public space as well.
So Zainah, what is Musawah doing to change the situation, and how?
Well, Musawah is really trying to bring about a change in the Muslim world by challenging the ways Islam is used to justify discrimination against women, and by building public support for the necessity and possibility of reform towards equality and justice for women living in Muslim contexts. We are at the forefront of what is a new movement in the Muslim world today and in minority Muslim contexts, where scholars, women's rights activists, and human rights activists are actually working together to produce new rights-based scholarship in Islam to reconcile religion and rights. And where women's rights groups in particular are at the forefront in organizing and speaking out in the public space to push for an understanding of Islam that upholds equality and justice. And for us, we believe that this is really critical in the Muslim world because most family laws in these countries are based on a patriarchal understanding of Islam to justify discrimination against women. And when women speak out to demand reform, to demand change, we are told that this is not possible. This is Islam. This is divine law, is God's words. So Musawah is trying to break this stranglehold, this hegemony that many in authority have over the issue of power, and authority in Islam. We assert that in countries where Islam is used as a source of law and public policy, everyone has the right to speak out on the ways Islam is interpreted, understood, and codified into law to govern the lives of citizens on a daily basis. And we claim that our experience suffering discrimination and injustice justified in the name of Islam gives us the authority and the right to make our voice heard and taken into consideration in the process of lawmaking. And of course, this work is controversial. And if you want to do this work, you will be attacked. You speak out publicly and challenge the authority of traditional leaders over the issue of religion. It is a tough job and not many people want to do it. But what is critical in this work is knowledge. To us, knowledge is power. So Musawah is a knowledge building movement where we approach the issue of reform in Islam, the effort to reconcile religion and rights through what we call the Musawah framework for action, which is a holistic approach that grounds our demands for reform based on Islamic principles, human rights standards, constitutional guarantees of equality and non-discrimination, and the lived realities of today. So it's a very holistic approach to law reform. And we have built a big body of rights-based knowledge in Islam to empower activists and policymakers to speak out publicly, because this work must be done in the public sphere, because you need to build support for a new narrative and a new understanding of Islam that upholds equality and justice, which is not the traditional conservative understanding of Islam. So this knowledge is very, very important. And we produce knowledge building briefs, policy briefs that really makes the arguments, that provide the legal tools and the legal concepts for reform readily available to make your case in the public space, to assert that you know what you're talking about, that you have a right to speak out on this. And critically too, what we do, we are trying to create more voices all over the Muslim world. So we conduct what we call the I Engage course, Islam and Gender Equality, which is a 7-day short course. And we have trained over 300 women's rights activists from 35 countries on how to help them better understand how knowledge is created in the Muslim legal tradition. So it's so important to understand and to break the myth that this is divine law. It is actually socially constructed knowledge based on a divine source, but it is created within context. And when that context change and that time change, our understanding of Islam also has to change in order to ensure that the principles of equality and justice that exist within Islam need to be forefronted. So this training we do really gives women, the knowledge and the courage to stand up, speak out, and stand their ground when they're attacked.
That's amazing, Zainah, and very inspiring. I think you need to grow this movement by leaps and bounds in the next few years,
Yeah,
and thank you. Yeah. So thank you also for joining from Malaysia. We know it's very late for you, and we will come back for you. If people have questions for Zainah, please write them in the chat box, because now I'm going to be moving on to our second panelist here. I'd like to introduce Joanna Lilja, who's the Deputy Policy Director of ACT Church at Sweden, which is part of ACT Alliance, the largest coalition of churches and church-related organizations engaged in humanitarian, development, and advocacy work around the world. ACT Church works with grassroots actors to promote gender equality. Now, Joanna, I don't think that people are really aware of the extent of discrimination in Christian family laws. How did you initiate your work through the church on discrimination in family law, and how is your church approaching reform?
Well, we also didn't really know about this. The issue of Christian family law was brought to our attention through the work of our sister church and partner, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Jordan and the Holy Land. And the issue had pretty much gone under our radar up until then, unfortunately. We knew that religious family law existed, mainly Muslim, but not much more. So when the church in Palestine started to work on a new family law, we realized that we needed to learn more about Christian family law and how we could engage. And the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Jordan and the Holy Land is really a small minority church. In 2015, they adopted on their own initiative a gender equal family law. And as far as I know, this is unique in the Middle East. It all started by the Lutheran World Federation, which is the federation of Lutheran churches around the world. They adopted a gender justice policy that is applicable for all their members. So in the church in Palestine, the policy initiated workshops and discussions with the Women's Committee in the church. And they started to question their situation. For instance, that domestic violence was not sufficient grounds for divorce under the current legislation that the church was following. So they decided to write a letter to the bishop requesting a new family law. And the bishop took the request seriously. A draft was created and shared with the synod, which is the highest decision-making body of the church. Initially, the draft was met with a lot of questions and fear and some anger. And I think what Zainah was talking about sort of links into, you know, the general sort of sense of that. And it took about 2 years of consultations and theological reflections to get people on board to actually pass the law. But now, with the new law, men and women have equal rights and responsibilities in marriage. They also have equal divorce rights and equal inheritance. And the church also set up its own court, and that includes a female judge. So for us, it's been really inspirational to follow their journey and work, and we hope that this will also inspire others. So what do we as ACT Church of Sweden do? Well, for us as a religious actor working with development and advocacy work with partners all around the world, it's been important to look at what we can do to contribute to reform. And we've seen 2 tracks. One is to encourage reform from within, and the other is use international advocacy to hold states accountable and push for reform. We've seen a need to raise awareness and building knowledge about Christian family law among faith actors and religious communities, since it's fairly unknown. And faith actors can really play a crucial role here through advocacy in their own religious communities to promote legislative change, but also through using other things like shadow reporting to the CLADEM committee regarding discriminatory religious legislation and share examples of how to change it. To be able to better raise awareness and share knowledge, we have commissioned an initial research to get a better overview of Christian family laws in the world. Our research so far has shown that very little research seems to have been done previously, specifically on Christian family law. So it's been quite difficult actually for the researcher to find enough information. And some laws are of course not even codified. To draw attention to the issue of discriminatory family law in general, but also religious family law in particular, at global arenas and when engaging with states and decision makers has been also really important for us. We know that we have good networks and that we have good contacts, and we want to use them. And we also see that we can play a key role in promoting religious literacy and understanding of religious diversity, not leaving the field open for just conservative interpretations of religious texts being the excuse for upholding discriminatory law, like Zainah was mentioning. So this campaign is really one of the ways that we seek to draw attention to discriminatory family law and mobilize international action for progressive law reform.
So yes, as follow-ups, Joanna, where are you seeing which countries? I know Mala did a presentation showing a cluster of countries where discriminatory laws. Is that the same areas where you're seeing the application of discriminatory Christian law?
Yes, definitely. So we can mainly find Christian family laws in South Asia, Bangladesh, India, Myanmar, and Pakistan, and the Middle East, Egypt, Iraq, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, and Palestine, and Syria. So they match with what Mala was saying before. And in some of these countries, there's also multiple Christian family laws. So according to which Christian denomination you belong to, you have your own legislation. So Lebanon would be the prime example where you have 15 different family laws. And it's also good to mention that Christians are usually in minorities in these countries that do have this separate legislation for Christians.
Well, thank you so much, Joanna. I know each of you can do a 1-hour webinar by yourself, but I am going to move on because we have like 7 different participants here. So I am going to move on to Flavia, and we are going to talk a little bit about traditional family and customary family laws. You know, we know that there are, in addition to religious laws around the world, there are customary laws, laws that government often allow to operate side by side with codified family law. Such laws often fly in the face of guarantees of equality in constitution or in codified law. And Flavia, who is Equality Now's global lead on ending harmful practices, and is also representing the Solidarity for African Women's Rights Coalition, which is a coalition of over 50 groups across Africa that seek to end discrimination against women, to speak on this issue. So Flavia, can you give us a sense of the range of customary family laws in various African countries, the challenges in reforming such laws, and how the Global Family Laws Campaign can boost reform efforts?
Thank you so much, Yasmeen. Indeed, it's very useful to come after Joanna because especially her last point around just how many laws you can have within one jurisdiction, given the diversity of communities that exist in that country. So just by way of background, so customary law is, from how I understand it in the African context, given that we have also countries that have plural legal systems, be they religious laws, formal laws, and also customary law, is basically those customs that are accepted as legal requirements and are actually an obligation for every member of society living in that context to follow and abide with. Unfortunately, they tend to be quite, as much as they're diverse, are not homogeneous because for example, if you're in Kenya, you have over 40 ethnic communities. Basically, that means over 40 sets of customary law operating within the same jurisdiction. So despite them being very diverse and not homogeneous, there's a continuous thread, i.e. of patriarchy. That is the continuous thread that we see running through many of these customary laws. And that being said, there's a diversity from country to country. Zambia, for example, Malawi, we have customary laws around, we have laws around, formal law around marriage, sometimes even defining a minimum age of marriage, for example, as 21. However, there's a common practice of girls getting married at puberty. So you find that sometimes, despite the formal law really stipulating that this is the minimum standard that shall abide with in line with formal law and international human rights standards, you find many countries still there's a tension in terms of compliance, or even the state does not really take enough measures to ensure that we are harmonizing all the legal systems within our country to ensure that we're protecting the women and girls. And then also, just to quickly move forward, is that the issue of customary law, just like has been described in other contexts, be it religious or Christian or Muslim law, largely touch on the personal life of women and girls, issues to do with personal identity, belonging, naming, how are you named, succession, inheritance, marriage, divorce. And in marriage, divorce, you have bride price, you have the age of marriage, you have the issue around wife inheritance, etc. So those are just by way of background. In terms of what the thing that really strikes me about African customary law that I think I'd also like to mention is the fact that it evolves. It evolves from one generation, 1 year to the next, with colonialism, with the pre-colonial, with the post-colonial, and then there's that flexibility around it, and it's very current. And what makes it law is that it's acceptable at that particular time in the society. And then the issue around not being codified is largely not written, it's largely not documented. So is this a good thing? Is it a double-edged sword? How do you reform that which is not written or that which is not codified? How do you engage in advocacy if it's really not somewhere that you can tangibly relate to it? But despite that being said, I think it's something that we can actually explore in terms of an advocacy perspective. This dynamic nature, is it something that we can work with, and what does it mean for us who are in this space? Just moving on before I touch on how we can link it to the Family Laws Campaign, the thing is also the resistance on the African continent in terms of when you talk about customary law. These are very, we want to guard it very jealously because it's an issue around identity also. So anything international law, international human rights standards are seen as very quote unquote Western, an imposition from the West. So it brings about a bit of resistance in terms of how we appreciate it. So where does the reform happen? Does it happen with the customary law to make it in line with the international human rights standards? Do we reform formal law that which we are calling foreign to make it in line with the international standard? And basically, how do we navigate that conundrum? But in terms of how we can link it to the family law campaign, just to conclude, I think it's in trying to understand this issue, I've noted that we have not been very purposeful on the African continent in terms of having like a campaign that's specifically seeking to reform family law or a customary law for that matter. It's been mostly around other pieces of work or advocacy around ending child marriage, ending FGM, inheritance rights, etc. But it's not really a unified piece of work. But I think there's great opportunity. But there's also what we are largely doing, especially when it comes to harmful practices, the social norms programming. When we're seeking to change social norms, if to end FGM, social norms to end child marriage, could that be seen as a way possibly of the African continent already trying to push and question customary law that allows for practices such as FGM and child marriage to continue? So I think that's one way. But also, more importantly, the Maputo Protocol, adopted in 2003 by African states and governments, and by is a political statement already by the African Union saying that customary law is only acceptable if it's positive, because Article 17 basically says that every woman and girl on the African continent has a right to a positive cultural context. So that already gives us a very good entry point as campaigners to ensure that we are pushing for states complying with the Maputo Protocol and to push for laws and legislations that ensure that there is no exemption given to customary law or other laws that are actually denying women and girls their rights. So I would say linking that to the family law campaign to the Maputo Protocol campaign is one key way that you can ensure that we arrive at that destination. Yeah.
So thank you, Flavia, for also mentioning the Maputo Protocol, because I think you have shown how difficult the issue of customary laws that are not codified, that are in very many countries in very many ways. So you need a combination of a bottoms up and a top down approach, I think. So Maputo Protocol definitely is a fantastic human rights treaty at the Africa level, and then people can't say it's Western imposition because it's an African treaty. Exactly. So I think that is, I hope that we can really start the work on customary family laws is nascent in many places, I would say, but I do hope that this family laws campaign will spearhead that. So, and thank you for joining on that. And I am going to, in the interest of time, move to our next two panelists, and we are turning now to the Latin American context, from Africa to Latin America. Cecilia Garcia Ruiz, welcome. She is the Regional Coordinator of Equal Measures 2030 for the Latin American country and Caribbean region, and the Project Coordinator of CLADEM, which is the Latin American and Caribbean Committee for the Defense of Women's Rights, and it's a regional network of women's rights organizations in that region. So Cecilia, welcome. I know that Flavia has already touched a little bit on child marriage within the African context. What do you see are the key issues of discrimination in family that active in the Latin American region, and what are activists they're working on? Can you talk about how this global campaign will help these efforts?
Yes, thank you very much, Yasmeen. Yeah, I mean, I want to say that despite the progress that the LAC region has made to tackle discrimination against girls and women, data shows that child marriage continues to be a pervasive practice in the majority of our countries, and that's why I'm also going to talk about child marriage in Latin America and the Caribbean. So, for example, according to the Sdg Gender Index that was produced by Equal Measures 2030, which is a tool that shows the state of gender equality across different issues related to the SDGs, this index shows that in Central America and in countries such as Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua are amongst the countries in the LAC region that perform worse on the indicator that looks at the proportion of women age 20 to 24 who were married or in a union before the age of 18. So for example, in Guatemala, Guatemala still has a gender discriminatory law, which establishes that the legal age for marriage is 16 for boys, for example, and 14 for girls with parental consent. And even in those countries that establish 18 years as a minimum age of marriage, we still see several exceptions that allow girls to marry. And we know that one of the many problems that come with early and forced marriage is that girls who marry at an early age are more likely to suffer various forms of violence. And we also need to look at other family laws that may be pushing girls to have early and forced marriage, for instance, to have access to property. So it's not an isolated problem that child marriage. We also need to look at it also related to other family laws, and this is something that we can also see happening in other regions of the world. Another key area of discrimination that activists in our region are focusing on is violence against girls and women. And if we look specifically at sexual violence against women in regards to family law, we see that there are still countries in Latin America and the Caribbean that do not recognize marital rape in the law, and this is particularly seen in the Caribbean countries. Or there are other countries that address this in the law, but the law is a bit ambiguous in regards to marital rape. And addressing violence against girls and women, specifically in the family environment as a structural problem, is extremely important for us, given the alarming increase in the number and severity of cases of violence in Latin America and the Caribbean, which in many cases end in femicides. So once again, the Sdg Gender Index produced by Equal Measures shows that the Latin American region is by far the lowest scoring region in the world on two indicators related to women's physical safety. And one of these indicators looks at the number of female victims of international homicide, where the region receives a very poor overall score. And we also know that 6 of the 10 countries globally with the highest rates of women killed in Latin America and the Caribbean are here. So 6 of those 10 countries. So how does this campaign really helps for the work that we are doing in Latin America and the Caribbean? I just gave 2 examples, but there are many others like equal rights of land and property that remain a challenge. And at the same time, we need to remain vigilant and prepared to act when fundamentalist and anti-rights groups try to create legislation and family codes that go against what has been achieved. So the Campaign on Equality now presents today, together with all of us partners and the people joining this webinar, is essential to draw attention to the family law that still needs to change or improve to accelerate progress towards gender equality, safety, and the reduction of poverty amongst girls and women. We believe that these global alliances are necessary not only to generate change, but also to support each other in countries where human rights defenders are persecuted, criminalized, and even killed. We also need to increase the investment to collect and produce the information on the issues related to family law, where we identify data gaps and analyze what other laws are needed for family law to provide equal employment and development opportunities for girls and women when they are still assigned the roles of care and household chores, just to mention a few examples. And just let me finish my intervention by saying that in all these efforts, governments have a key role as well as other partners like the ones we are part of this campaign. So thank you.
Thank you, Cecilia. And I know that like for Latin America, your region, there's not an issue of explicitly discriminatory law as we saw in Mala's presentation. So we have gone from Muslim to Christian to customary to a region where the law is not explicitly discriminatory in the same way, and you have issues of child marriage, marital rape, and you've linked it also to femicides and all the issues of violence against women and women's employment. And from you, it gives me a pleasure now to move to our next speaker, which is Mahnaz Afkhami. She's a founder and president of Women's Learning Partnership, a partnership of 20 autonomous women's rights organizations that promote women's leadership, civil engagement, and human rights. Women's Learning Partnership has also recently launched a book, which is called Feminist Advocacy, Family Law, and Violence Against Women, with case studies from several countries. So Mahnaz is going to give us a big picture around the world. And Mahnaz, welcome. I would like to ask you a question that I think may be in many of our minds. How do we get men, especially men in power, involved in this campaign? And what are you seeing on family laws around the world?
Thank you for that question, Yasmeen. What we have heard has been so enlightening and interesting. Our partnership, as you mentioned, are 20 grassroots organizations on 4 continents, but they also work in 20 languages in 60 other countries. So we have learned a lot in the last 2 decades that we have worked on issues of women's empowerment. One very important piece of it being family law. What we have learned is that the family is really the foundation of human organizations. That is, we learn how to relate to each other, not only on the basis of gender, where little girls are taught how to behave, wear pink, cross their legs, speak slowly and not aggressively, how little boys have been taught to be ambitious, to reach out, to want to be leaders, to be aggressive. Not only from that cultural, behavioral piece, but to all of the other ways of leadership and management and behavior. It reflects itself in communities, in civic organizations, at the universities or classrooms, in economics, in politics, in government, everywhere. So our task is really huge. It's not limited to legislation that is either called family law or family status law. It involves civil law, it involves criminal law, it involves all the various types of legislation that relate to how men and women act together. And of course, the wonderful question is, how do we get men, the 50% of the population, to participate? But not only are they 50% of the population, they're the 50% who holds power. They're the 50% who makes decisions. They're the 50% who decides to go to war. They're the 50% who decides how do we conduct ourselves now that we're facing, let's say, this particular pandemic today. And also, even more importantly, there are brothers, there are sons, there are husbands, there are lovers. So we're so interconnected that without having that 50% participate, we're not really going to get anywhere. But also, we have to realize that we have had a way of relating with each other, the top-down hierarchical, they're the power and we are the complement or the subsidiary. This is something that has been helped by all of these areas of human endeavor. Politics has supported, religion has supported, culture and the arts have supported. So in order to change all of that, we have to first come to terms that this is the situation that we are in, the victimization that we have experienced is basically not the result of 50% of the population who are related to the other 50% in such intimate ways. It's not that they one day decided they're going to oppress the women. It's because a way of living earlier times required some sort of division of responsibilities and power and economic sustenance, that women lived about 35 years to 40 years average. They were pregnant most of their lives. They had 7, 8 children, that most of whom died, and on whom they depended for sustaining economically. So things have changed. Science, technology, all of that has changed our lives. It's no longer necessary. For a long time now, it hasn't been necessary to have this type of abusive and oppressive relationship. But to change it takes infrastructure, or very, very extensive and comprehensive culture change, and change in every aspect of our behavior, including our religious values. But we have to be careful not to minimize the the solutions simply into one religion or one set of actions or simply to legislation. If we are going to change, we have to do all of that, plus changing the structure of relationships beginning in the family and going up to community, society, and internationally. So we can start from making sure that the knowledge that we have, some of which has been shared already, that countries cannot be successful, there cannot be peace, there cannot be development, there cannot be advancement without the whole population relating to each other in new ways. And we as women have those new ways to offer. So we have to tell the men, make them understand that they're not our enemies, and that we need to think together to find solutions, to change these particular ways of behavior, which has brought us war, which has brought us violence, which has brought us poverty, which is ruining our environment. It's time to stop all that and rethink. They have things to teach us because they have had for many, many years the run of the show in terms of how to manage the world, how to lead, how to be ambitious, how to be aggressive. We can learn some of that from them, not too much of it. We don't want to lean in too much because we don't want to be women in pantsuits. But what we want to do also is for them to learn from us our long experience of nurturing, of problem solving, of negotiation, and of peace building. So the two groups together will be capable of doing anything at all. And also, it's not only is it going to be a better world, it's actually the urgency of existential urgency of changing our ways and having a better life. And the
so on that, Mahnaz, can you also give me an example of something like that that you as Women Learning Partnership have been working on to change that culture, to bring men on board? And I give you like about 2 minutes.
Okay.
Sorry, it's like...
Thank you. Well, for one thing, we have developed the concept of leadership, which comes from having experience on the ground that what women want. And to tell you the honest truth, when you talk to grassroots women from Afghanistan to Zimbabwe, I'm sure some of you have had that experience, what they say is more or less the declaration of human rights. And so everyone wants those rights. How to get them is to change the way we relate to each other, as I mentioned before, to learn from the immediate group, which is the family all the way up, how to relate to each other on a respectful, participatory, horizontal model of dialogue-based leadership. And that's the concepts that we have worked with through narratives, working with women, the narratives that we have developed together, but adjusted linguistically and culturally to local situations. Family law advocacy is one of the main ones, and as you know from Equality Now, we are all involved in one piece of it, which is a very important piece of it, and that's the citizenship, that women in many societies can't even just hand over their citizenship to their children and their husbands. So we're working together to change the nature of leadership involving advocacy for change from family all the way to community. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mahnaz, and thank you for the bigger picture and for the reminder that it is not all just the laws. The law is the first and foremost work, and then there's a whole bunch of other work to be done side by side with legal change. So really thank you for being on and providing that perspective. And I'm now going to turn to our last speaker. And just a reminder to people, to the extent that you have questions for any of the panelists, please go into the chat on the side of your screen and put them in. My colleague Antonia is collecting all those. So I am now going to go to Beatrice Duncan. I started off by saying one of the reasons that we are launching this campaign now is because there's international momentum, including at the UN and at the World Bank. And we heard a bit about the World Bank study, Women, Law and Business, that Mala presented. And I'm very excited to have Beatrice Duncan, who is the Rule of Law Advisor and the focal point for minority and indigenous issues at UN Women. And she will speak about how this campaign is situated in UN Women's Equality in Law for Women and Girls by 2030, a multi-stakeholder strategy for action. So over to you, Beatrice.
Thank you very much, and for inviting UN Women to be part of this important process. So I just want to put a few issues into perspective and why UN Women sees this issue as very important. We believe and understand that the issue of family law is important because the family is the only setting within which you see the full life cycle of women at play, right from birth until death. So women as wives, women as daughters, women as grandmothers. It is only within the context of the family that you see women in their diversity expressed and displayed. This creates a number of opportunities as well as risks for women and girls, but largely risks, because due to patriarchy and the understanding of how society has evolved, placing men as the breadwinners and the household heads actually means that women and girls have a low status within the family. It places them in a very precarious situation. And by this, I'm not just referring to women and girls of low income groups. I'm speaking of women and girls across every single spectrum of society. So in practical terms, what it means is that if men and boys are given the higher status within the family, if an extension, agricultural extension officer enters a household, for example, be it in Kenya or India, the first question that that extension officer would ask is, who is the household head? I would like to see the man of the home. As a result, it is men who are receiving knowledge. It is men who are receiving the resources to be able to earn an income, to be able to develop themselves. Now, UN Women is very concerned about this because this impacts upon every single facet of women's lives. Even the simple ability of a woman to be able to register her child when that child is born is brought into question because the norms and the rules suggest that only men can do that. Even when it relates to transferring nationality to her husband or her child, many countries insist that only a man can do that. Even when it relates to deciding where a married couple should live, place of residence, choice of employment, many, even industrialized countries, the law suggests that only a man can do that. In many countries, a woman needs to seek permission from her husband even to go out. A woman needs to seek permission from her husband even to start a business. This is not good enough. And we are saying that enough is enough. We are also concerned that several countries have entered reservations to Article 16 of CEDAW, which actually relates to marriage and the family. This therefore suggests that many countries do not believe in equal rights for women and girls within the family. So this is highly problematic. And I also wish to mention that even the courts, high courts, courts of appeal, Supreme Courts have translated these negative social norms into their decision making. So this would tell us that even with law enforcement, where we believe that the courts should be a place of protection, have now become places where women cannot even receive their rights. So indeed, yes, you did mention this strategy, which has a very long name. We are working with 16 other partners to implement a strategy which brings the issue of family law, left, right, and center to the debate on discrimination in law. And what we are trying to do is to embark upon a campaign to encourage member states as well as the private sector and civil society organizations to help us to gather momentum on the need to address discrimination in law in general, but family law in particular. And by family law, I also mean the work around the minimum age of marriage, which we know has been highly contentious. 50 states, as I speak, do not recognize 18 years as the minimum age of marriage. As we speak, 90 countries have exceptions that allow parents and even the courts to allow girls to marry below the age of marriage, or to even have a different age of marriage to that of boys. We are working with judges, we are working with the police force, we are working with civil society, we are working with parliamentarians. As you know, the Interparliamentary Union is part of this global campaign. We are even working with them now to produce a handbook that would help parliamentarians to understand why it is important for us to address discrimination in law.
Thank you so much, Beatrice. There's a lot of work, and we are so happy to have UN Women as a key partner to this campaign. So with this, I mean, you guys now, everybody on this webinar has gotten a flavor of the types of work, and I do apologize for the brevity of everybody's interventions. I think each of them can do a 1-hour webinar on their strategies on their own, but I hope you have gotten that this is a big multifaceted campaign that works with people around the world in different kinds of strategies and brings it all forward, because I think that is the way that we can actually chisel away at this last bastion of discrimination. We will have one of our partners, Zonneveld, who is the founder and president of Muslims for Progressive Values, close this session. But meanwhile, I want to hand over now to my colleague, Antonia Kirkland, who has been collecting your questions, and she will lead the question answer session. So I will say goodbye to all of you, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Yasmeen. My name is Antonia Kirkland. I'm the global lead for legal equality and access to justice at Equality Now. Thank you all so much for participating in this really interesting webinar today, and for all your really amazing and on-point questions. We are going to try and cluster them so that the speakers can answer a group of questions at a time. So first, Zainah, I'd like to address a question to you, and then Joanna, both of you, actually. In addition to international law requiring governments to ensure equality in the family, as we heard from Beatrice, what are those of you who are actually working within the religious frameworks, Muslim and Christian in this case on this webinar, doing to engage and educate the international human rights community about the issue? And secondly, how are religious leaders responding to your advocacy at the international level? Thank you. Zainah, you're muted.
Thank you very much for the question, because it really gives me an opportunity to talk about a really important area of work for Musawah, which is our international advocacy work. So since 2011, actually, Musawah has been intervening in the CEDAW process, in the CEDAW sessions when governments go to report on their progress or lack of progress in complying with treaty obligations under CEDAW. And for the past 8 years, we've been submitting thematic reports on Article 16 on marriage and family. For Muslim countries, 31 countries actually we've intervened when Muslim countries or countries with significant Muslim minority report to the CEDAW committee. And very often, in those years, governments go to Geneva and basically wave the flag of religion and say, we cannot comply, we cannot amend our discriminatory laws because these are divine laws, these are God's laws, they are Sharia laws, they cannot be changed, they cannot be challenged. So it is not us, it is Islam. Yeah, or it is not us, it is the community that doesn't want change. So governments have been flying this flag of religion, and very often the CEDAW committee couldn't go beyond saying, well, your laws are discriminatory, they're against your treaty obligation, go change your law. So nothing constructive and substantive was coming out to enable governments to move forward. What Musawah has done through our thematic reports and through our table, we've developed what we call the positive developments in Muslim family laws to show that many Muslim countries have actually progressed, move forward to amend their discriminatory laws against women. So if indeed the point that we make to the CEDAW committee and to get the CEDAW committee to make to the governments, if indeed you say that this is divine law that cannot be changed, why do many Muslim countries have different laws on the same issue? For example, polygamy, it's banned in Tunisia. It's practiced with restrictions in many other countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, Morocco. It's practiced without restrictions in some other countries. And it's all, the source is Islam. So there is diversity of law. So in the end, obviously, the issue is not one divine understanding of Islam that makes reform impossible. We point out the issue is really simply patriarchy and the lack of political will and courage to push forward on women's rights. And Musawah's work showed that reform is possible. And our engagement with the CEDAW committee has now led to very specific recommendations of constructive steps that governments can undertake to move forward towards ending discrimination against women in family law. And the CEDAW committee has really, and OHCHR as well in Geneva, have really welcomed the presence of Musawah in Geneva to really push, to provide the knowledge, to provide the arguments, to enable the CEDAW committee to have a more constructive engagement with governments and help governments point out the ways forward and how other governments have moved forward in the reform process. So that's really important work, that we've been doing with a treaty body in Geneva.
Thank you, Zainah. And before we move to Joanna to answer the same question as to how they're engaging at the international level, could you also address briefly how religious leaders have responded to your advocacy?
Well, there are progressive religious leaders who, of course, welcome our work and want to engage with us. And there are the conservative ones who think that what we do typically, is against Islam, is against Sharia, is against God. So that challenge that we've had, from day one until today exists. But I think the reality on the ground is waiting for no man. So today, actually, 10 years after the launch of Musawah, we are increasingly actually getting demands, requests for dialogue sessions. So they're beginning to ask us, to talk with them, to tell them about our work, show the progress that is made, because many of them live very isolated lives and are not aware that change is taking place in the Muslim world, that law reform has taken place in many Muslim countries, and our work shows that to them, and the arguments, the different ways that Islam is interpreted today to deal with the changing realities of today, because they were brought up with the scholarship of the classical period and they're not familiar with the new scholarship that is just burgeoning today in the Muslim world. And so we bring this to them in the dialogue sessions that we have. We've had dialogues in Egypt, with Al-Azhar scholars, with staff from the Mufti's office, with the imams of mosque in the governorates. We've had dialogues with Sharia court judges in Palestine. We've had dialogues in Sri Lanka with the male members of the Ulama Council that drafted this discriminatory family law. But because there's strong opposition from the women's groups, they want to know why and what can be done. So I think it's amazing that this opening is taking place. And I really must mention the fact that there is this incredible movement now in Indonesia of women ulama, women religious scholars who are organized. And I went to a meeting, their first meeting of 500 grassroots women religious leaders who issued fatwas, 3 fatwas against domestic violence, against child marriage, and on environmental protection. And they used the Musawah framework to issue those fatwas. So it's like amazing the impact that we've been we've had, because it's a way forward. So they argued for their fatwas against child marriage and domestic violence by arguing it within using religious principles, using the Indonesian constitutional guarantees of equality and non-discrimination, using the human rights treaties that Indonesia is committed to, and using the lived realities, because these are women ulama at the grassroots level who work in the villages with the community. So they know the problem of domestic violence. They know the problem of child marriage. So they bring this out and use this as an argument that change is absolutely necessary and change is possible by using this holistic framework that Musawah has developed. So I think the reality on the ground is really pushing traditional leaders to open up their minds and at least start engaging, in dialogue with groups that are pushing for reform.
Thank you, Zainah. That's very, very encouraging to hear your examples of successes at the local level as well. Joanna, perhaps you could briefly address the question of how you're engaging with the international community, but also if you could define what you meant by rights and responsibilities in the family very briefly, as we only have about 5 minutes left before we have to close out. And we also have a question for Flavia about engaging with traditional leaders and what that might look like. Thank you.
Yes, thanks. I'll try to be brief. So some of the things that we try to do in terms of building knowledge and capacity is that we each year have a training on women's human rights advocacy for faith-based organizations in Geneva. And this mainly focuses on the CLADEM Convention and how one can engage with a committee. In that training, I mean, that sort of entails all sorts of things on the CLADEM and how you can do advocacy and that and the UPR. But we try to really emphasize the importance of Article 16 of the Convention on Family and Marriage and try to show for the participants the link between that and religion, because I think it's quite clear. Some other articles, the ones talking on norms and stereotypes, obviously also is very closely linked to religion. So that's one of the ways we try to build capacity. We also think that it's really important for us to network with secular feminist movements and women's rights groups and build alliances, because quite often we run separate tracks, I think, religious and secular feminists. And in this kind of issue, we see that we need to do it together. And that's what's so great about this campaign, I think, that we're sort of bringing together different actors that perhaps are not normally working so much together. We also try to raise awareness through side events at the CSW. We do written and oral statements, policy briefs, or briefings for politicians. But this year, we had, in a very broad coalition, we called it Faith in Beijing, a coalition of faith-based organizations. We pulled together a number of policy briefs, but also written oral statements that we wanted to take to the CSW. And because of the situation, obviously, that's not happening now. But then family law was actually one of the 3 key areas that this coalition, this very broad coalition, wanted to highlight during CSW. So we feel that a lot of especially Christian actors that we are involved with, they're really interested in this issue. They feel they haven't got enough knowledge and they want to engage. And in terms of religious leaders, so some of the people that are already in this coalition are religious leaders, and they acknowledge they need to learn more. But I also want to mention, when I went to India a couple of years back, I met with the Christian Council, and we held a seminar on interreligious marriages, because that's also quite a big problem for a lot of people. Family laws become a problem because you can't marry between if you belong to different religions or even between Christian sects. So it was then really clear to us that the Christian leaders did not themselves know how to influence the law, or did not even know actually what it said. So we felt that that's one of the reasons why we really need to build knowledge, because if you don't know what the law is or how you can change it, how are you ever going to be able to engage with it and reform it?
Thank you so much, Joanna. I would like to now turn to Flavia to talk a little bit about how you see us engaging as a global campaign with traditional leaders and how you've seen that work in Africa in particular.
Thank you so much, Antonia. I think the issue of religious, rather the traditional leaders is very critical, especially on the African continent, because despite the diversity that we see on the continent, I think if there's another continuous trend is that many jurisdictions or many countries have an equivalent of a chief or a local elder who most of the time, given that as I mentioned earlier, the law is not really written and codified most of the time, but there's a custodian of that law. There's an entity or someone who is basically responsible for ensuring that we are following the customary law, as it were. So this is also very diverse on the continent. There are some countries where it's very well structured from the top to the bottom, and in some cases it's rather loose because we are all evolving at different rhythms. So, for example, in Sierra Leone and Liberia, I would say that one of the countries that's been even a bit difficult to even penetrate in terms of ending harmful practices, because in Liberia, for example, you have the National Council of Chiefs and Elders of Liberia, NACEL. That is a very well-oiled mechanism for that is basically the custodian of customary law, etc. But also you have countries such as Zambia and Malawi, where we have seen movement from within, basically change coming from within, and there have been very progressive female chiefs who have literally taken, for example, ending child marriage as a personal mission, and we have just if a quick Google search on chiefs in Malawi, you'll see the kind of wonderful work that's being done by Chief Kachidamoto and others. So that's the variety we are seeing in terms of the influence and the ability to move. Then another refreshing thing that is also quite encouraging is also the organizing at the continental level. We have the Council of Traditional Leaders of Africa, COTLA, I believe with the support of UN Women, where we are trying to, we are seeing an acknowledgement, a recognition that chiefs, for example, are a very crucial entity in terms of progressing women's rights and equality across the region. So that organizing at the African level is also quite critical for us. And as I mentioned earlier, mirroring that on the Maputo Protocol, we already have a very strong and progressive framework on the African continent that allows us to start conversation with states on these issues. Also, roping in the chiefs and elders is also a very critical aspect. As I conclude, I think I would like to say that also something that I find very challenging, especially now that we're saying customary law on the African continent is largely patriarchal, etc. In the process of roping in the traditional leaders, the chiefs and elders, etc., sometimes we find ourselves in a very hard place as women's rights advocates, in the sense that we find ourselves having to make difficult choices. Because I'll give an example, engaging with a chief in Zambia who's very progressive in terms of pushing for ending child marriage, being a male, being a man, you find that sometimes as women's rights advocates, even be able to approach him as activists, etc., you have to go on your knees. You can only speak to them when you're down on the ground, bowing and all those things. So I think so you have to make a difficult decision at that point. Do I want the conversation to continue on ending child marriage, or shall I defy even some of these requirements of us as women and women's rights advocates that may be patriarchal or may be pushing for the patriarchy? So in terms of trying to end the patriarchy, sometimes you find yourself either reaffirming it or ignoring certain signals or requirements that are also quite frustrating, as it were, depending on what your lens is as a feminist. So I would say that for me, this exercise has been very interesting in conclusion. I think there's so many reflections, there's so many questions to ask, but I think the linkages are there, and I'm looking forward to further discussions around how we can reform customary law in the broader context of the family law campaign. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Flavia. As we only have a few minutes left, I would like to turn it to Annie Zonneveld. But before I do that, because there were so many questions that we didn't have time to answer, you will see at the end of this presentation my email. So please feel free to send us your further questions so that we can try to answer those if we didn't get to yours today. So Annie, the founder and president of Muslims for Progressive Values, will summarize this very interesting discussion and give us some next steps. Thank you.
All right, hi everyone. As Dr. Htun highlighted, the disempowerment of the economic advancement of women is the result of family law. There's enough statistical evidence proving that there's an inverse reaction, that the more women have economic independence, the less gender-based violence there is, whether it be Muslim Sharia law, Christian laws, African customary laws, or what have you. And it is for this reason, I think, UN Women's Initiative Equality in Law for Women and Girls by 2030 is the sharpest strategy to advancing women's economic independence, which has the ripple effect of addressing much of the Sustainable Development Goals. Let's take a micro example. An economic independent mother will educate her daughter and will not marry her off due to poverty. And there would be, therefore, likely not be a need to do FGM on her daughter or to make her attractive for marriage. An economic independent mother will also know that her daughter will support her economically in her old age. What is remarkable is that family laws are flexible and they flux depending on who's sitting as a judge in the family court. The laws are mostly not codified, and then in itself is self-evident that there's no basis on God's law unless the judge assumes the rule of God. As a positive change that is taking place in Kenya, Muslims for Progressive Values, in partnership with our partner, the African Muslim Women Action Network, a community-based organization in Mombasa, we are working with the Chief Qadi of Kenya in reforming the Islamic religious court, the Qadi court there. What we are doing is we are taking CEDAW report filed by Musawah and the Kenyan Organization of Advocacy for Women and Peace and Security in Africa to actually do the reform work in the field. At the community level and with many religious leaders, there is a deep desire for change. As advocates for reforming family laws, we need to think differently. Frame it as a self-interest from the child, the woman, the man, the religious leaders, and society. So if there is a desire for change, that is, the women's movement is poised and even religious leaders are stepping up. So what's holding up the legal reforms? Two things, patriarchy system and funding. This forum is evident in our readiness and willingness to work at fulfilling the many resolutions, SDG 5, Beijing +25, equality in law by 2030, Mobutu Protocol on a global scale. Resolutions, agreements at the government level are important, but does not mean much to those impacted at the individual level. For them, it's all talk. We must not disappoint them, especially young women. They are our future. If you're interested in joining the conversation, please contact Antonia. Her email is on the slide. We hope this virtual launch is an indication that COVID-19 will not slow our resolve. If anything, our global campaign is the perfect time to double down our work digitally, as many are looking for online content to pass time. As we know, the digital platform is an important medium to influence people's thinking and attitudes. We have seen it used negatively. Let's be just as aggressive and use it for a positive outcome. But the time is for action. This family reform coalition movement needs funding, and the time is now. Thank you for joining this conversation. Back to you, Antonia.
Thank you so much, Annie.
Hello, everybody. This is Yasmeen, back to you, and we really thank you. I know that Antonia had a whole bunch of other questions. We thought we were out of time. We still have 10 minutes time, so I don't know if we would like to just end here or do an additional question. Antonia, if you can just indicate if there's one more to be answered, or we will end here and then try to answer your questions, by email. And we also want to say that this is the first, I believe, of many, as we are all stuck at home. This will be the first of many conversations that we will convene as a webinar, and we will look to next steps on the Family Laws campaign and how we can have more in-depth conversation with each of these partners and beyond. So please stay tuned for that. And with that, I guess we will sign off, and I hope that you all remain safe and healthy once again, and look forward to the next time. Mahnaz, did you have something to, oh, Mahnaz just ended up. So
I was just saying, if you don't mind, Yasmeen, that now that we have our people here, if they would like to watch the film on family law that we have the link to, if they would like to take a look at that. And also on WLP site, there is a corpus of laws that of Muslim majority countries that we have had working on for 10 years now. They're available to everybody for comparison. Zainah mentioned how important it is to get the more positive ones as encouragement for advocacy for the less positive ones. So those laws exist, from penal codes to family laws to constitutions. They're all on the WLP website for your use.
And absolutely. And at the end of it, whoever signed up for this webinar, we will be sending them a list of resources available, which will include video, which will include studies, and all our work, which will include UN Women, Musawahs, Women's Learning Partnership, Equality Now. That will be sent by Antonia to everybody. So Zainah, did you have final words?
Yeah, I just wanted to share with you in terms of moving forward. Musawah is launching a campaign for justice in Muslim family laws that's bringing together activists, scholars, and policy makers from Asia, Africa, and the Arab world. And so what we're doing is really building a global network to galvanize support and build momentum towards the urgency of reform of discriminatory Muslim family law. So we're so happy to link up with this global campaign for equality in family law to build this global solidarity and urgency on family law reform across regions, religions, culture, and tradition. So I really hope we'll send you the links, and those who are interested in working on Muslim family law, we're really, really happy to have you join the movement as we build it, and we build solidarity, we build knowledge and campaign strategies together. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Zainah. I will definitely be on, and we will send this information also out to all of you. I know Mala had joined briefly. I don't know if you wanted to say something, and then I will let Beatrice have the last word. Mala?
Thank you all so much for being here and listening today. On the slides are sites of some of the papers that I have written about family law and other women's rights issues. In case you're interested, my website is also malatun.com, where you can see a list of my publications and other things that I'm working on. Thank you so much, and I look forward to collaborating with all of you in the future.
Okay, Beatrice, we will give you the last word, and then we end this webinar. Oh, we can't hear you, Beatrice. You're muted. Nope. Okay. So I guess we are having trouble with Beatrice's audio. Beatrice, can you try again? No. So I apologize for that. I will end this webinar now. We will send you all the resources. We will send you next steps and, ways to continue this conversation. Thank you very much to UN Women. Thank you very much to each of our very wonderful and very diverse partners. For Equality Now, it is a pleasure for all of us to work with each and every one of you and help move the dial forward. We do recognize that these are very difficult and unprecedented times, but we are really hoping that the focus on women and girls will continue to be as healthy and as strong as we have been building up over the last at least 25 years, if not longer. So thank you, God bless, and goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you, Yasmeen.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you.